Welcome back. You're listening because you want to get past the headlines, right? To really dig into these complex topics shaping our world, but without needing, like, a decoder ring.
Exactly. You want those connections, those insights that make things click.
And that's precisely what we aim for in these deep dives.
Today, we're exploring something pretty weighty: the potential parallels between historical empires, specifically their decline, and what might be happening with the American empire right now.
Our main source for this is a YouTube video featuring the economist Richard Wolff. It's called Richard Wolff, Trump, Hitler, and the End of the American Empire from the Robinson Earhart channel. We're working for the transcript.
Now, that title, it's designed to make you stop and think, for sure.
Definitely. But let's be really clear up front. Our goal here isn't to say figure A equals figure B. That's not the point.
No, not at all.
We want to pull out the key ideas from Wolff's analysis about the possibility of an American decline, using history, like Germany's path to Hitler, as a kind of reference point.
And connecting that to current events, as discussed in the transcript, you should expect some, well, maybe surprising historical links and definitely some things to chew on.
Okay, let's get into it. That comparison, Trump and Hitler, it's obviously loaded.
Hugely loaded. And the speaker, Wolff, tackles it head-on in the transcript. He actually starts by saying he strongly disagrees with any direct symbol equation.
Right, he calls comparing Hitler's actions to Trump's absolutely ridiculous and just crazy. So it's vital you understand the analysis isn't making that claim.
Exactly. But then he explains why he draws parallels. And it's more subtle. It's not about the individuals per se, but about the pressures leaders face.
And the kinds of moves they might make when their country is in, well, deep trouble.
Precisely. It's about the situation, the context, rather than the personalities being identical.
Okay, so with that framing, the transcript brings up Trump's comment about removing, what was it, anti-American improper ideology from the Smithsonian?
Yes, that's one specific example Wolff uses. He sees it as illustrating a kind of defensive nationalism.
And he connects that to bigger ambitions Trump has mentioned.
Right. Things like wanting to take back the Panama Canal or acquire Greenland or even take Canada away from the Canadian.
Wow, okay, those are big ideas.
Yeah.
And Wolff frames these as possible crusades.
Yeah, potential crusades a leader might launch when a nation feels it's losing ground, maybe losing its dominance. It's like projecting power outwardly to mask internal weakness or anxiety.
Okay, I see the logic there.
And he draws a direct line from that idea to the mood in Germany before Hitler. He talks about the German working class being shocked, upset, angry, and feeling like they had no way out.
So the idea is that widespread discontent can make people receptive to these kinds of nationalistic projects, giving them a common enemy or goal.
That's the suggestion. It's a way to try and unify people when things feel like they're falling apart internally. It's a potent historical warning.
Okay, so moving beyond specific leaders, the transcript also discusses broader signs of a potential decline, right?
Right.
As Wolff sees them.
Yeah, a fundamental point he makes is simply that every empire, historically, has declined. Every single one.
Which directly challenges that idea of American exceptionalism, the notion that the U.S. is somehow different, immune to history.
Exactly. He questions that assumption. And he finds it striking that this whole topic, potential imperial decline, is barely discussed in, say, presidential elections.
It's like the elephant in the room nobody wants to talk about.
Pretty much. He also points out a potential contradiction in Trump's rhetoric, criticizing Russia heavily for taking Ukrainian territory.
While sometimes seeming to advocate for the U.S. doing similar things, like taking territory itself.
Right. That inconsistency.
So what's the explanation offered for that?
Wolff suggests that, when your country's falling apart, one of the ways you hold it together is to go on a crusade. He even speculates a leader might end up attacking everybody just to create external enemies and foster internal unity.
A sort of rally round the flag effect taken to an extreme.
Yeah.
Sounds dangerous.
It's presented as a risky, desperate strategy. Then the discussion compares the political situation in pre-Hitler Germany to the U.S. now, focusing on the left.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, Wolff emphasizes that Germany back then had extremely well-organized, very powerful left-wing movements. Huge socialist and communist parties, unions, some even with armed detachment.
Yeah, very strong organized opposition.
He contrasts that very sharply with what he sees as the relative weakness and lack of similar organization on the U.S. left today.
Which leads him to ask a pretty stark question, doesn't it? Does that weakness make the U.S. more vulnerable to something like fascism?
His answer in the transcript is blunt. You bet. He then sketches a scenario where Trump could mobilize supporters, maybe groups like the Proud Boys, perhaps even uniformed,
To do what?
to, in Wolff's words, terrorize anybody who opposes that un-American improper ideology he mentioned earlier, connecting the Smithsonian idea to broader suppression.
And that resonates with some current events, like the controversies on campuses over pro-Palestinian speech, or officials talking about deporting students for their views.
Wolff seems to point to those kinds of things as potential warning signs, yeah? He also mentions the perceived weakness of the Democratic Party, talk about new parties emerging, and even splits within the Republican Party, the signal gate issue.
It sounds like the whole political system is under strain.
That's the picture painted. Wolff sees Trump less as a cause and more as a phenomenon, a symptom of a society that senses the breakdown of the traditional political order.
Because he's an outsider. Didn't come up through the usual political ranks.
Exactly. He didn't learn the political game like traditional politicians. And Wolff suggests that maybe that's part of the appeal when people feel the same old doesn't fly anymore.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit to the economy. The transcript uses a really vivid analogy for Trump's economic approach.
Yeah, the Hail Mary pass, like in American football, you know. Time's running out, you heave the ball downfield, hope for the best, a long shot.
A desperate measure, essentially. And the main tool in this economic Hail Mary is tariffs.
Tariffs are presented as the primary weapon, yes. Wolff acknowledges, look, tariffs have been around forever. There's tons of research on them.
Right, it's not a new idea. But what does all that history and research actually tell us? Is there a clear answer?
Well, Wolff's conclusion, as presented in the transcript, is basically, we don't know. The effect of a tariff isn't automatic. It depends entirely on the context.
He used that analogy about saying a curse word.
Exactly. The impact depends completely on who you're with and the situation. It's context dependent.
So when Trump says tariffs will definitely lead to positive results, Wolff is pretty skeptical.
Deeply skeptical. He suggests that kind of certainty probably means you don't fully grasp the complexity of the economic forces involved.
And he gives examples of how it could backfire.
Oh, yeah. Potential impacts on coffee prices if you tariff Mexico, or worker remittances flowing back there, or hitting Canada with tariffs could raise lumber or electricity costs here.
It highlights how tangled up our economies are.
Totally. And the big risk, Wolff points out, is unintended consequences. Like maybe China just steps in and becomes the supplier or market instead, undermining the whole point of the U.S. tariff. Because the U.S. isn't the only game in town anymore.
That leads nicely into other signs of maybe a shift in global reality, like sanctions policy.
Right. The transcript points to the failure of U.S. sanctions against Russia over the Ukraine war as a major example. Wolff argues it stems from a failure to grasp the new global economic reality, the rise of China, the BRICS nations.
Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa.
Yeah. Their combined economic weight makes it much harder for Western sanctions to bite like they used to.
And the irony that Russia apparently still sells oil to Europe, just through other countries.
Exactly. It shows the limits of that kind of economic pressure now. The transcript also touches on some domestic policy contradictions.
Like the situation in Florida, wanting to deport immigrant workers but needing them for agriculture.
Yeah, that example. And then the subsequent talk about maybe loosening child labor laws to fill the gap. Wolff presents these not as isolated mistakes, but as symptoms.
Symptoms of what?
Of something deeper, like a drowning person grabbing at anything, even if it makes no long-term sense, just trying to stay afloat.
A sense of desperation overriding rational policy. He also mentions how the U.S. is perceived globally.
He suggests there's a growing view in some parts of the world of the U.S. as a warg country, maybe like how North Korea is often portrayed here. And things like Trump's shifting stance on TikTok are seen as more evidence of erratic, maybe self-defeating policy.
Okay, this brings us back to that historical comparison, the rise of Hitler. Wolff gives a quick overview in the transcript, saying it's relevant to the U.S. today.
He does. He starts in the 19th century Britain as the top dog, but the U.S. and Germany rising fast, competing hard.
And Germany was industrializing rapidly, had a strong working class.
Very strong, big socialist movement, organized labor, a dynamic, confident nation in many ways.
So what went so wrong?
Well, the transcript highlights a sequence of devastating blows. World War I defeat, the harsh Treaty of Versailles reparations, then the absolutely catastrophic hyperinflation in 1923 that wiped out savings.
Unimaginable hardship.
Followed just a few years later by the Great Depression hitting globally. Just wave after wave of economic disaster and social shock.
creating fertile ground for extremism.
That's the argument. Massive disillusionment, a feeling that the old systems had failed completely. And into that vacuum steps Hitler, this outsider figure. Wolff notes the political split, traditional parties versus socialist communists, and crucially, the business elite deciding to back Hitler.
And Wolff draws parallels between that German experience and the U.S. now.
He points to several things: the long-term trend of wealth shifting upwards in the U.S., the recent shocks of the pandemic and inflation, a sense that America's global standing isn't what it was.
And a large segment of the working class feeling, again, upset and without a clear path forward.
Exactly. He suggests those conditions, economic stress, political division, a sense of lost status, echo some of the factors that destabilized Germany back then. It's a cautionary tale.
Definitely sobering. Now, the transcript also specifically addresses Elon Musk's role in all this.
Yeah, someone must have asked about him. Wolff says, look, rich people influencing politics isn't new in the U.S., but he finds the way Musk does it and the scale kind of unusual.
How so? What stands out?
Well, there's a report about creating a whole Department of Government Efficiency, apparently just for Musk, bypassing normal procedures. And the sheer amount of money involved, reportedly huge sums, like $300 million going towards Trump's efforts.
That's a lot of influence. And it's not just money.
No, the transcript mentions Musk seemingly trying to sway elections directly, a Wisconsin court race, even weighing in on German politics, apparently offering money for petition signatures. Wolff characterizes it as part of a pattern of flying by the seat of your pants, maybe even chaos.
I remember that image of him with a chainsaw at Twitter, or X, when announcing layoffs.
Wolff brings that up too. He sees it as terrible PR, the world's richest man symbolically taking a chainsaw to Jobs, but also just inefficient. Mass firings are often less effective than careful restructuring and can lead to legal trouble if done improperly.
And how does this connect to the bigger picture of global shifts?
Wolff suggests these kinds of actions might be symptoms of instability. He also links Musk's reported issues like falling Tesla sales or negative perception in Europe, partly to his association with Trump, suggesting that in a changing world, these connections have consequences. U.S. influence isn't automatic anymore.
The discussion then broadens out even further, looking at Europe's potential decline and what might come after capitalism as we know it.
Right. Wolff paints a picture of Europe becoming, relatively speaking, a less dynamic corner of the world, technologically and industrially, compared to its past dominance.
He jokes about England becoming a cold, wet offshore island again.
Yeah, a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it makes the point. He suggests this is partly because Europe is tied to older forms of capitalism, maybe slower to adapt than, say, the U.S. or China historically. He brings in Marx's idea of uneven development.
The idea that capitalism grows faster in some places than others at different times.
Exactly. Which helps explain why the U.S. and now China surged ahead. He also senses a denial of the decline of Europe among its leaders.
So, if empires rise and fall, and maybe Europe is declining relatively, what does the future hold according to the transcript?
Two main possibilities are kicked around. One is that China simply becomes the next global hegemon, the next empire. Or maybe, just maybe, the world moves towards something different, genuine multinational cooperation, a world without empires constantly vying for dominance.
Hasn't that been tried before? League of Nations, UN?
Wolff acknowledges those attempts, but he suggests that perhaps now, with a clearer sense that even a superpower like the U.S. might be facing decline, a more serious effort at real multinationalism could be possible.
Maybe. That ties into the concept of hegemony itself, which the transcript discusses via Antonio Gramsci.
Yes, Gramsci, a really important figure in 20th century Marxist thought, a leader of the Italian Communist Party.
Imprisoned by Mussolini, right? Wrote the prison notebooks.
That's him. And he developed the idea of hegemony in those notebooks to figure out why Italy didn't have a Russian-style revolution, even with lots of unrest.
And his insight was that it wasn't just about economics or politics.
Exactly. He argued that culture, things like music, religion, family life, common sense ideas, plays a huge role in maintaining the status quo. The ruling class doesn't just rule by force, but by shaping how people think, their subjective conditions.
So people consent to this system, even if it's not fully in their interest.
That's the core idea of hegemony, how power operates subtly through culture and ideology. Gramsci's work hugely influenced how Marxists and many others think about culture and power. Wolff mentions how Gramsci's communist roots were sometimes downplayed in U.S. academia, referencing Louis Althusser in France as another prominent communist intellectual.
Interesting. The transcript also touches on Mao Zedong.
Yeah.
How does Wolff position him?
As incredibly significant.
Mao's key contribution, according to Wolff, was adapting Marxism to China, specifically recognizing the revolutionary power of the peasantry, not just urban factory workers.
Which was a major shift from traditional
A
Marxism.
huge shift. It vastly broadened where revolutionary movements could take root globally. Wolff argues this laid the groundwork for China's later economic trajectory after World War II.
And notes that Mao is viewed very differently in China than in the U.S.
Yes, generally much more respected there. The transcript gives a quick sketch: early CCP involvement, conflict with Chiang Kai-shek, the Long March, eventual victory, founding the PRC, the Taiwan situation.
What about China's current economic system, that mix of state and private? Is that linked to Mao?
Wolff explains Mao's complex relationship with the Soviets, the eventual split, and China deciding to find its own path to socialism. Not the Soviet model, not Western social democracy. The current system may be roughly half state-owned, half private, but all under strong Communist Party direction is presented as the outcome of that unique path.
Different from the old Soviet command economy and different from somewhere like Sweden.
Very different. And Wolff concludes, well, you can argue about it, but China's current economic success suggests this hybrid model has been remarkably effective for them.
Wow. We've covered a massive amount of ground conferences, historical empires, Trump, economics, sanctions, Germany, Musk, Europe, Gramsci, Mao.
It really shows how interconnected everything is, doesn't it? From historical patterns to today's headlines, economic shifts, political ideologies.
And it really drives home the value of looking under the surface, beyond the personalities, to grasp these bigger forces at work.
Definitely. So maybe the thought to leave you with, based on everything we've unpacked from this transcript, is this. If historical patterns hold true, and if we are indeed seeing signs of major shifts in global power and economic systems, what are the really critical choices facing us now?
What paths are actually open beyond just swapping one empire for another or sticking rigidly to old models? Are there truly different futures possible?
Exactly. Something for you to think about. Maybe dig into some of these ideas or figures further on your own.